Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone had a great, quick 30-minute health break. Our second session is ready to get started. We have everybody in place. So just as a quick recap, our second session is called Navigating Difficult Experiences When Patient Engagement Doesn't Go as Hoped. And now I'm handing this over to Thomas Smith, our moderator for this session. Thomas.
Rebecca, thank you. Good evening, everyone from Brussels. We're here today to talk about when patient engagement doesn't quite go to plan, where the tensions are, how we can improve things and things like that. I have given our speakers today a blank canvas to say whatever it is that they want to say, but the only price that they need to pay for that really is to be constructive. We're not here to complain. We're not here to sell ourselves. We're here to have an open, honest, transparent and constructive conversation. I'm going to keep my eye on the Q&A tab. So if you have questions for anyone, including me in the call, please put them in there. And I shall try and do my best to sort of weave that in as we go forward. Speakers, if you feel ready, willing and able to engage with those sort of, with the chat and the questions yourself, please feel free to do that. And also feel free to comment on what each other are saying, because ultimately this should feel like a conversation. My name is Thomas Smith. I'm a patient advocate and patient engagement consultant from the UK. I've been working at above disease level and across disease areas now for about 7 years. I work with patient organizations, regulators, medcoms companies, pharmaceutical companies, biopharma companies, and essentially read as anybody who wants to do a good job. Meaningful patient engagement is really what I care about. I'm a patient expert at NICE. I've been working for a research ethics committee since 2018. I'm a Party Fellow, and I'm also a trustee at one of the UK's largest mental health charities. But really, that's all kind of boring, title-y kind of stuff, and ultimately should not impact the value of what I say, think, or do whatsoever, really. What's important to me, though, is that I love what I do. I feel incredibly grateful for all of it. And really, I can't do anything else. This is what I care about. It's for me, it's complete mission orientation. I've been living with cystic fibrosis since I was born in 1988. It's not a huge part of my personality, because here in the field of patient engagement, there is vast moral, commercial, social imperative, for example. Now, it's a genuine privilege to be able to hand over to some amazing speakers. And one of the things that I love about what I do is it connects me to other people across the planet who know what it's like to not have a normal or straightforward life. So we're going to start with Mr. Michael Falcon before we head over to Nichole Jefferson. And then we're going to finish it up with the fellow Brit, Sally Crowe. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. My name is Michael Falcon. I am clinically and professionally, I'm licensed in occupational therapy. I'm from the US and I work as an academic at Hawaii Pacific University. I am an individual that's been working sort of in the lived experience space, specifically working in international and global pain space for about 5 or 6 years now. I've been living with chronic pain for 17 going on 18 years. I'm an amputee due to a motor vehicle accident a long time ago. And just like Thomas, it's not really a big piece of my life anymore. It might be one of the first things that you see, but it's definitely not who I am. Yeah, I've like Thomas, have enjoyed sort of being in this space, operating from the perspective of the lived experience, honing in this experience or this expertise, and translating that in the international global space as it relates to pain. Thank you.
Nichole, over to you.
Hi, my name is Nichole Jefferson, and I live in Dallas, Texas, in the U.S. During the day from 9 to 5, I work for a major financial institute in risk and compliance management. However, 24 hours a day, I'm a kidney patient. I've received 2 kidney transplants. My most recent transplant was in April of 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. So I have had to navigate with people, to obtain that second transplant. What I do also as a patient advocate is I do speak with clinicians, nephrologists, researchers. I serve on several advisory boards to make sure that everything is up to standards and it meets compliance for the patients and for everyone. So that's where I come in with the patient engagement and make sure the patient engagement is at the first and foremost beginning of any type of clinical trials that are done.
And Sally, over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sally, and I'm joining from the south coast of England. Currently, I contribute to research from a service user perspective, mainly head and neck cancer, and also as a carer of my mum. I also coach people involved in patient engagement, both patients and professionals, and I've been doing that for about 3 years now. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years advocating, facilitating, campaigning for better patient engagement, mostly in the research space. That's me. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much. I think what you can see in the chat already is people resonating with the idea that your diagnosis is not you. You know, it's like, it's a small part of it. And sometimes I think that patient engagement can, or patient advocacy can steer people towards that a bit, or rather not reward the confidence and experience often it needs to be able to say that comfortably. You know, I'm not my disease. It's just or my illness. It's a small part of me. And because we are here today to talk about what doesn't go well, again, we're going to be constructive. We're not going to complain. I think, Sally, what we need to do is we need to talk about what it is that you feel strongly about, which is conflict resolution. And as this is a blank canvas, I'm going to hand it over to you to start wherever you want to start, to say whatever you want to say. Off you go.
Okay, thanks very much, Thomas. So this session is about when things don't go as hoped. And I think I would like to raise the topic for discussion in this panel and debate around conflict, and specifically the fear of conflict in patient engagement in research. And I remember when we had a planning call for this session, and Thomas, you talked about people dancing around their handbags. And it's a very English phrase, but what we mean is we're sort of dancing around the issue. We're not really dealing with something that's really bothering a lot of people. So I want to spend a bit of time just deconstructing that. And I'm going to approach it from a personal perspective. So the reason I feel so strongly about this is because I've had my own sort of conflict journey, if you like. I grew up in an alcoholic household. Conflict was a completely normal part of my life. As a result, I sought out the least conflicting situations to be in and spent a lot of energy suppressing my own anger, even when I had good reason to be so. I then realized from therapy, following a period of quite bad depression, that this is not very me. And that at heart, I wanted to challenge situations that I thought were unfair or harmful, and therefore needed to manage my own internal conflict and recognize others. So professionally, I found I was drawn to projects, patient engagement projects that were often difficult, for example, in contested diseases, polemic, or where there were competing priorities at play. And this is where I learned to manage conflict in patient engagement contexts. And this is what informs what I'm just going to share with you in the next few minutes. So conflict is interesting. It can be disruptive. I also think it can be constructive. And I think it engenders often very polemic feelings. Some people are totally in fear of it and avoid it. And when I see people in patient engagement situations that look like that, I'm often thinking, are you unheard? Are you unable to say what you need to say? So there's something about what sits behind how people experience conflict. Of course, some people relish conflict, and I'll come on again to that in a minute. So let's just return to this idea of disruptive conflict. In my experience, both as a patient and as a facilitator of patient engagement, I've seen disruptive conflict quite a few times, and it often stems from profound disagreements around a topic or a discussion. And it's about how do we bring people together to manage what is such different positions. Sometimes people experience disruptive conflict because they're disrespecting other people's views or positions on a topic, and they're even disrespecting their experience in an area of health, for example. Another aspect of disruptive conflict, I think, is when there are very different interpersonal styles at play, and particularly around communication, how we communicate. In terms of constructive conflict, I personally believe it can be an agent of change. I think it can open creative doors. I think it can help establish honest and more transparent spaces for conversations. And really importantly, I think constructive conflict can actually challenge an orthodoxy or a groupthink scenario, and that is so important. And strangely, if conflict is managed well, it can be quite cathartic. You know, we talked about dancing around our handbags a minute ago. This build-up, this tension, knowing that something needs to come out. And sometimes when that is managed and it does come out and then there is progress, it can be very cleansing. I think when I thought about this session, I thought, what do I want to say about conflict? And I think for me, it can be systemic or even cultural. In other words, conflict resides in some organizations, some communities, and some groups. And Michael, I know, is going to talk a bit about the context and cultural context of when we work in patient engagement. So I won't stray too much into that. So I think there's something about the system and the construct of the way that you're working that can be conflicting. But of course, conflict is also very personal. And I'm sure we're aware of people that seek it out. I've certainly seen people who want conflict because it's stimulating. It's dramatic, and we all love a bit of drama, and it can be very controlling. It's quite a breeding ground for power play. So that's one person on one end of the spectrum, someone who's seeking it out, who's prodding, who wants to use it as an element of control. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who completely avoid it. And my experience is that people that really want to avoid it often disengage entirely. And that's such a shame, because then we just don't get the benefit of their experience, their perspectives, what it is they came to talk about. In terms of managing conflict, I think there's something about being realistic too. You know, I'm a great planner. People laugh at the way I go about things, but I plan everything. And I think what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about conflict in patient engagement is trying to prevent what is harmful and can be prevented, but also slightly expecting and maybe even accepting that sometimes it can't be prevented and it doesn't want to be prevented. And in that case, you know, the important things, the watchwords here are around harm reduction, self-care, and being able to see the constructive elements. And years ago, I mean, 20 years ago, I was involved in a project called the James Lind Alliance, and I was responsible for coming up with the methodology, the way we were going to run what are partnerships of patients and professionals that are coming to an agreement about what our research priorities. It's called the James Lind Alliance. And I remember thinking, we've got to expect that there's going to be real disagreement, real potential conflict here, because people are coming into these partnerships with very strong feelings about the research that they would like to see addressed. And so we thought about all the things that could go wrong, all the banana skins that could be trodden on, and built into the planning and the process of these conversations about research priorities, things that actually actively managed potential conflict and extreme disagreement. I have got some other ideas around how to manage conflict, and I might be able to come back to those, and it's fine if I don't. But what I wanted to finish on is that research is a human endeavor. It's about people. And I think yesterday, I can't remember his name, Michael maybe, was talking about taking a humanist perspective to patient engagement. And I think there are some fundamental questions about the way we work together as groups or communities or even in organizations, which focus on who are we? How do we connect? How do we differ? What do we share? And I think if we spend time on some of that before we enter into our potentially difficult conversations, it can really help manage conflict. So that's what I wanted to finish on. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back to Thomas. Thanks, Thomas.
Well, Sally, thank you for that. There's a lot of comments in the chat agreeing with you. And I think, just on my own experience, I've had it, clearly I was born with my disease. And I think it can turn you into a passenger very early in your life or in formative sort of teenage years and things like that. And I'm still working through that. I'm still trying to kind of, shake it off. Maybe you could speak about some examples about like conflict that you've experienced in patient engagement or that you've heard from others and things. And we've got some questions in the chat, which I will jump to as and when possible. So I've seen them. Leave it with me. Sally, over to you.
Sorry, I just unmute. Thanks very much, Thomas. Yeah, I've realised I've got the wrong glasses on for this session. I can't read the questions properly, which is unforgivable. So I shall do my best. But I think somebody's mentioned in the chat about who decides what's constructive and destructive. And that's a really insightful comment. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's Christopher. That is about power. And I think when we know we're going to have difficult conversations, so for example, I gave the example of research priorities, which are riven with strong feelings and emotions. And there's things to lose and there's things to gain in those conversations when you're deciding what is it you're going to put your muscle and your money behind research. And I think it's about having structures and goals and processes that actively share out that power and help people engage with each other around areas of disagreement. And that can be about who's in the room and is it balanced? It can be about who's using up the air. And there's a polite term that I use for people that do that too much, and I call them over contributors, which I think is a really polite way of saying you're talking too much. Other people aren't managing to get in on this topic. So I think the way you structure a conversation, be it how people sit around a table even, and also who is managing that conversation. Are they a completely neutral person? Do they have anything to lose or gain as to what happens at the end of this conversation when we get to our goal? And the answer should be no, they should only be concerned with managing a process. If they've got a vested interest in what the outcome is, I'm afraid it makes them biased towards potentially difficult conversations going in one direction or another. So I think Christopher's on the money here. A lot of it is around money. Around power and managing that. That would be my main number one piece of advice is manage the power dynamic practically and be very aware to it in the room and be watching and listening and seeing how it's playing out non-verbally and verbally.
Thank you. It's about being receptive, isn't it? It's not rocket science, a lot of what we do. But it's easy to understand how things kind of can slip away from us. Shyam Sundar has asked a question about how we develop a skill set for genuine patient engagement work in the research community. But I think that could potentially be a great question to finish on, to have everybody feedback, perhaps. Nichole, is there anything that you'd like to add to what Sally said?
I do, Thomas. And actually what I was going to add on to Sally goes into the question that was just asked. A lot of times people will say they want patient engagement, but they really don't. They are doing it to check a box. They are doing it because it's the in thing to do right now. So we have to make sure that those researchers, clinicians, and anyone who's reaching out to us and they say they want patient engagement, they have to really want patient engagement and really understand the value of it. sometimes people are just doing what the next person does. And then a lot of times once you're in there, you can have a seat at the table, but if you aren't able to say anything or speak and be heard, then the seat at the table really doesn't mean anything. So I think it starts with the people in the beginning to make sure this is what they really want. Because I would prefer, as a patient, I would prefer just not even doing patient engagement if you're not going to do it right, if you really don't want it.
Which takes tremendous confidence and experience to be able to say that, or even think it.
Yeah.
Michael, anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, there's quite a bit. I love Sally. Thank you for getting us started. This is great because it leads into so many other things that we're talking about and appreciating here. And I know Sally was alluding to some of the conversation that we had in preparation for this, which was I think this much broader conversation around power. And I already see a lot of the chat sort of alluding to it as well. I mean, when we talk about communication foundationally, this mutual agreement of how we are going to converse, making sure that the language that we're using is aligning, even in situations where we are literally using the same words. The messaging is different, the perception and interpretation is different, and it's so huge. Someone in the chat wrote that conflict often comes from differing expectations, and I love that because it's so spot on, but there's an additional implication there. There's an implication that there are prerequisite implications to begin with, and that's what Nichole was just talking about. There should not have been implications if you're wanting to engage in patient engagement. You should go into it with no expectation and then allowing that organic conversation, that organic relationship to develop whatever expectations from the work are going to come of that. That's this concept and idea of co-creation in the patient engagement space. I know in the pain space, we're starting to see some of that begin to emerge in research, somewhat in academia, at least in my program. I'm pushing it as much as I can. But it's so true in so many of these research spaces, there is a prerequisite, there is a predetermined expectation of what should occur to get that checkbox, yes, for that researcher, for that academic, or for that grant funding. And that's what it is. It's a fairly superficial checkbox, and that sort of sets this whole foundation, this culture, this expectation, this anticipated power dynamic for how this relationship is going to go. So at the very beginning, it's flawed and it's floundered to begin with.
Thank you for sharing that. I think Joe has made asked a question, not made a comment, in the Q&A about the safe space for disagreements to happen, which then is also sort of straying into this idea that often patients are regarded as not ill-prepared, but just often with an axe to grind, before they often speak. I'm not suggesting that that's true. But I think, Michael, it does lead nicely on to what you would like to talk about, which is about the importance of understanding the environment that you wish to push into, and the culture that surrounds it. So again, blank slate. What do you want to say?
Yeah, I think when it comes to power and culture, from our perspective, from the individuals that lived with whatever our experience is, going into these dynamics, going into these cultures that we're hoping will engage with us in certain ways is a fascinating thing. And I think this goes to a lot of what Sally is doing. I think there's this underlying current that maybe is not always aware from those of us with lived experience. There's a perception that we are going into this space with academics, right? Some of the most highly educated individuals that we have on this earth, researchers, same thing, highly educated. And there's this perception that they are aware of everything that we are talking about. And that precursor or that prerequisite allows for this concept of conflict, for disagreement, for misaligned expectations, because the reality is these academics, these researchers, these clinicians are very narrow and very siloed in their awareness and education of something that we are expecting them to be experts in, but they are far from experts in it. That's the value that we bring in this. We bring in this expertise that they just do not have awareness of. And it's this massive thing that I think plays into this whole role, this whole culture of power, where we have so much more leverage and influence than I think we actually appreciate.
And you know,
Nichole.
I want to piggyback off of what you said, because this is something that's really been grinding my gears lately. When they want to bring me in as a patient, there are a couple of things. First of all, they'll say they need a Black patient. Well, I don't represent all Black patients. They try to do that in another part of the country, but I don't, part of the country, which is the Midwest, doesn't resonate with me as a Black person from the South. Another thing, when I go in here, they do try to undermine or think we don't know much and that they know more than us. And like I always say, my lived experience is just as valuable, if not more valuable, than their learned experience. So they should treat us as such and treat us as equals.
And I would argue from a clinical perspective, it's more valuable than the learned
Yeah.
than the
Yes.
learned education. There are so many health professions that hear the lived experience but don't really know what to do with it. There's such a lack of education there, what to do with our experience, with the valuable information that we have that they cannot possibly have. We are the only ones that can give them this. And then what to do with it is still lost, whether it's we're talking about the academic side, the research side, or the clinical side. There is so much that is still unknown on how to apply our information, our expertise, our forefront research that we are giving them. They don't know what to do with it. And so from a power perspective, there's a massive shift there that if you can learn to wield it, learn to utilize it, it can have significant influence in these spaces.
Sally, would you like to add anything?
I'm just seeing in the questions that I think I'm relating to Michael's point about sort of the culture side of things. I think there's something about, and I'm just reflecting on a comment as well, a lack of clarity seems to be coming through on some of the chat. And I think this is some of the root of why it's difficult, because we don't really know why we're sat around a table. Well, somebody does, hopefully, because they bother to invite people, but often it gets lost in translation. And I think clarity of purpose, expectations, and where are the points of compromise? What's good enough? Are important features of setting up patient engagement. And I think sometimes if you start to drill down into why things feel difficult, it is precisely because, as Nichole just said, you know, somebody's there under completely false pretenses, or they're there to do something that's ridiculous. It's not possible, but nobody wants to really talk about that. It's just like, you know, there's a person sat there, they look about right, okay, let's move on. And that's not what it's about. So I feel myself getting quite angry, upset about it.
Justifiably so sometimes, I think. And this is a safe space to share whatever you want to say. And I think, Nichole, we're probably going to come back to that in a bit. And so I think there's something in that about building in somehow an ability to be more agile, and also understanding the pressure that puts on a person to be the patient that represents our disease or our community or whatever. And because it's like, I don't know, you don't want to let anyone down, and you want to carry the flag well. And it's a lot of pressure, and often maybe you are like engaging in a room full of people that you are sort of intimidated by, which actually leads me on to Michael. My question for you was going to be, like, clearly you have academic qualifications by the truckload kind of thing, and some patients do, and some patients don't. And I think that, again, in my own experience, my education was completely disrupted, really. So if you, and also like when you get a PhD, it takes years of your life. Those are years where you are working in research environments, you know. But if somebody doesn't have that, Nichole, did you want to add something? No, okay. If somebody doesn't have all that experience in those environments, how do you think that they could be prepared for it, or what do you think that the environments can do to help them in, but also they might be able to do to help themselves?
Yeah, I think in terms of the environment, from the environment perspective, I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done. I would argue, start beginning in the academic programs. I think the way that my program educates my future clinicians needs to put the client first, needs to put the patient first. And it's sad that I need to say this, but all healthcare programs, there is no reason why we should not be educating on the lived experience throughout the program. It shouldn't be this one-off course. It should be this concept throughout every healthcare program across the globe. And it's sad to say that it's not. We are graduating clinicians, researchers, and academics that somewhere along the line have forgotten how to be empathetic to the human suffering across from them. And it's a massive problem that we experience, especially in our Western programs, but it's there and we know that. So from the academic side, I think that's where we start foundationally, how we train our clinicians, our academics, and our researchers, putting the patient first, putting the lived experience first, and what that actually means, and not calling those things soft skills as if they're less than something major clinical, because they're not. I would argue they are the most important thing to any lived experience person, to any patient. That is the most important thing you can do, is how you treat another human. So that's the first thing. From our side, I would argue you already have your expertise. It's your experience. I think the more reflection you can do on how your experience has impacted your life comprehensively, that is your PhD. That is the education that you come in with. That is the value. That is the literal monetary value that you bring to these teams, to these programs, to these entities that they simply do not have. And in most cases, they aren't even aware that they don't have this valuable information. It's gold, and you have it at your fingertips already. I think the more that you can converse about it, the more you can explain it, the more comprehensive you can think about it, I think the value is there. And you just have to spend time with it.
Thank you for sharing that. It's invaluable because it's hard to get people from academic institutions to open up like that. Which there's a question here from Martin David, who basically asks about how can we motivate researchers to care and engage more? Do you think the answer is just better research, better data, and things like that?
No, I don't. I think it's how we educate them. Again, going back to from the foundation, I think with some of these programs, I think they're so intense. You have individuals that they're. I like to say this to my clinicians, to my students. Everybody entered this profession, this program, again, regardless of what health profession program, with great intentions to serve individuals that are suffering. Every one of them has it. The same thing with researchers. They are there for the right reasons. Somewhere along the lines, the programs get so intensive, so narrow, so devoid of other human engagement and human contact, they lose or forget this sense of humanity. It happens. And so they're hyper focused on the research and how to do the research, the processes and the ways of getting grant funding, all these things. And then you start layering these alternative priorities when at the foundation was how to help humans that are suffering. And it gets lost. It gets lost in translation somewhere. So again, I think foundationally, if we can keep that at the forefront throughout, when you're writing a grant, how do you write it in collaboration with someone that is living the experience so that it reflects the project down the road, rather than this is how I'm going to fix this problem, blah, 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 down the road. And it comes out this very distorted research project.
I mean, we can leave out the wider conversation about academia as a whole and how things are changing in there. But also, I'm just thinking, I'm not a PhD. I dare say it would be completely beyond me to get one. However, it sounds more fun. Like if you build in this kind of expertise in your research and things like that, it sounds way more fun. But I think now we probably need to, and by the way, the questions we're probably going to get to at the end, anything that I haven't answered. So, Nichole, we're going to move on to our headline act here. No pressure. But actually ties into what we've touched on before, and also the pressure of being a headline act. Maybe you'd like to share about the pressures or the barriers that you feel come with being the only patient in the room. What do you want people to know, and what would you like people to think about and consider?
You know, being the only patient in the room, it is a lot of pressure because I do feel like I need to speak up. And then also sometimes they forget I'm the patient in the room. And one particular situation that happened 2 months ago, there was an organization, they were trying to get patients to do a focus group. And so my question to them was, how much does it pay? And they said, oh, nothing, it's just an hour on Zoom. I said, wait, no, I'm not going to bring people into a focus group where you are not willing to pay them. This is their time. You are gaining valuable information from patients and you don't want to pay them. And a lot of times they think because they're a patient, we don't have to pay them. We don't have to do anything. Again, as I stated earlier, my lived experience is it. And I'm the only person who can tell my story. I'm the only person who has gone through what I have gone through in that order. So yes, I am an expert in Nichole Jefferson. So in order to do that, I need for you to accommodate me, compensate me. And like someone was just put in the chat about that emotional labor, there's certain parts of my story that are not pretty. And every time I have to explain them and every time I have to tell it, there goes my mental health that I have to try to bring in and calm down. And I think that's the problem because they say, oh, we can just get a patient. And then back to the patient, to the problem earlier, they don't look for a patient who meets the specific needs that they want or that they need. They just find any old patient with kidney disease. This person will work, that person will work. And they don't even know if their story even aligns with what they're trying to say. So that's my hot topic button right now. Sorry.
Yeah, and God bless you, because it's something that I feel so strongly about. And I genuinely did not know you were going to say that. I didn't know you were going to take it down that route. But before I bore everyone to death with how I feel about it, Sally or Michael, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I would just add to that as well. And on the research clinic or clinical, even academic side, it's it's not only just finding someone, but it's finding someone that I can tolerate, that I am comfortable with, that doesn't make me feel uncomfortable as an academic, as a researcher, right? And so many times when you tell your story and it's a bit too much, it's a bit too emotional for me, I'm uncomfortable and I don't know what to do with that, right? I don't know how to interpret that. I don't know how to take all of that in. And that's where a lot of hesitancy comes in. There's a lot of fear in working with individuals with lived experience. And sometimes there's not even awareness that it is fear, which is a fascinating thing as well.
Sally.
I was in a meeting to do with my particular type of cancer, and the topic was delayed diagnosis, which was my experience. And I made a really interesting strategic decision prior to going into this meeting as a patient. I did a PowerPoint slide of my journey, and it was like looking at a sort of ping pong going from one to another to another to another, and the time is going on. And it was really interesting because the level of conversation was very academic and clinical, and it was about tackling delayed diagnosis, which was incredibly important in this really rare cancer. But when I finished my PowerPoint, it was only like a minute or two. It was like suddenly there was this silence, and it was like putting the human experience onto a problem that clinically they were very frustrated about. They were very upset about, because they were obviously seeing patients coming with really much more advanced cancer than need be. And there was something about me deciding to do it in a particular way that then allowed me to say at the end of this PowerPoint presentation, which was one slide, and just how it affected me emotionally. And I felt it had an impact then. So in a way, I was playing a game. I think I was saying, I'm going to do what you do, which is to present a slide, and then I'm going to tell you how it actually felt. And that was an interesting experience for me as a patient, being in a room of clinicians and researchers. So yeah.
Thank you, Sally. I think that I think that, I know, Michael, you mentioned that you're not a fan of the soft skills label, but I think just communication skills training is perhaps one of the things that lacks in the patient community at the moment. We've got a lot of unbelievable knowledge about how drugs are developed and brought to market and how regulators work and things like that. But as far as being persuasive and speaking in a compelling way that people want to listen to, there's not much out there. So if anybody wants to make a killing on training, that's where I would say you should go with it. And also, again, we have to go back to how sometimes patient engagement and participating in the paternalistic healthcare systems that we all participate in kind of often does steer people to, like talk about the lived experience and whether people, how much that changes things for any, I suppose, company or academic institution remains to be seen. Somebody posted in the chat about a paper that they published on it. So if you can scroll up and find the link, feel free to click on that and check it out. And Nichole, like I say, I'm trying not to bore everyone to death with how I feel about it. So is there something about, because I suppose, having said that, diversity, equity, and inclusion is clearly a massive topic. And when you work with some governmental organizations, you cannot get paid a livable wage. So by nature, often the people that engage with patient engagement, either through regulators or anywhere else, can afford, for some reason, to not get paid. And you're never, you're never going to get the diversity that you want and need if you can't give people money to pay for their childcare or just the loss of income and things like that. So is there anything in particular, like if you could click your fingers and just ignore all legal and compliance, all practical considerations, what sort of solution would you like to see or idea would you like to place under the nose of someone who can make a decision about that kind of thing?
I think, the thing I like to place under their nose is, again, about the respect, because now I'm not saying that everything I do that there's a payment attached, not by any means am I saying that. A lot of times I do things just because I want to help the community. I want to see the community grow and I want to, see people learn. But also, if you're coming to me from a major organization or anything like that, and you haven't, offered me anything as a token of my appreciation, then I have a problem with that, because to me, you're saying, I don't care about you. I don't want to hear anything other than this, just one thing to tokenize you. And one of the things that whenever you're going for a grant in that situation, the patient should be included in that grant, and giving money to the patient should be included in that grant for you to, to make sure that you are paying patients properly.
Thank you for sharing that. I couldn't agree more. And if I could click my fingers and make anything happen, it would be that. I think we've got about 15 minutes left. So I think now might be a good time to start working through some of the questions in the Q&A. Shamsunda, I'm still going to try and hold that how do you develop a skill set last. I do think it's a good takeaway for everybody in the room. This one is probably for Sally. Alison Soprovic says, do you find any differences between virtual versus in-person patient engagement practices regarding the emergence of conflict and its management or potential resolution?
Great question, and very topical, really. Even today on this online conference, the answer is yes, I do. I think when you're in person, you can read other people, you can read their whole body, you can feel tension easier. I think people communicate in such interesting ways, and very often saying something is the last thing they'll do. And I think that we can see more in person and feel more and be more empathetic as well, actually. And I think you can pick up the cues that something is heading down the line or something is building. I'm not saying you can't do it online. I just think from, so if I put myself into a facilitator mode, I think it's a lot harder online. That's my personal view. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it is a lot harder. And I sometimes wonder about what people get out of it online versus in person. In person also allows you to more efficiently support people, safeguard them, enable them to have some space if things have got too much, all those things that I think are important about having difficult conversations sometimes, or people sharing things that are very personal to them, or so the answer is yes, I do. But I suppose being pragmatic, we live in a virtual world, and I suppose the onus is on us to get better at it virtually. And I think probably we are doing that. We're finding ways to do that. But I worry about people on calls, either when I've been a patient or as a facilitator, that just disappear online. It's so difficult to find out what happened to them. Are they okay? And I think if you're going to run something that you know is going to be tricky online, you should always have thought about how to find out about people afterwards, or even have someone on the call whose only job is to help people behind the scenes. So we've got a great backup team today, and it's really nice to know they're there. Hopefully we won't need them, but we know they're there, and that's an important feature, I think, of online working.
I think the challenge there would be to articulate or make numerical the value of that extra cost. That would be the challenge, wouldn't it? How on earth you would do that? I thank God that it's nothing to do with me to figure that out. Michael or Nichole, is there anything you'd like to add before we move on to the next question?
I guess the only thing I would add is really after the pandemic, I think we've seen a lot of opportunity for more engagement be allowed to occur because of how much intentional work we've done digitally as well. I mean, of course, I completely agree with Sally, especially as a hands-on clinician, primarily hands-on clinician. Person one-to-one engagement is there is nothing that's better. But for so many individuals with a variety of different lived experience, us expanding into the digital world has allowed certain people and certain populations that cannot engage for a number of different reasons, whether they're homebound or pain or depression, anxiety, all these different symptoms and reasons why they could not get there in person has allowed this space to occur. And so I think how Sally ended there is perfect. Is we should just continue to expand and continue to learn how to do this space safely and appropriate and continue to get better at it, with the appreciation that in person is still going to be paramount for sure.
Nichole, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, Michael and Sally have said everything.
That's fine, thank you. Michael, we're going to stay with you because the next question from Ushma Patel is about if you are working on a research project and you're meeting 4 to 6 times a year, do you have experience or any ideas about how you can keep up the momentum to keep people in that gravity? Because it can feel a bit, what's the word, orbital, can't it? You come back around, you have a meeting and then you're back out again for a couple of months. How do you think we could improve that?
Yeah, for myself, I think it's comfortability, reaching out and genuinely being a part of that team. If you are feeling disconnected, reach out and say, hey, let's get back in touch. Let's do something, get back on a call and see where everything is, because I think this goes back to what Nichole was talking about earlier. 4 to 6 times a year, if that's not how the entirety of the team is working, then your role is fairly tokenistic. If you're not included in how the entirety of the team is operating, maybe meeting a couple times a week or a couple weeks a month, whatever the case may be, whatever the frequency is, then it's a genuine engagement. Then it's a genuine relationship there. So I think it's having an appreciation for what your actual role is, what their anticipation is your role is going to be, and feeling comfortable advocating that you have a role there. That's more than just this 4 to 6 times, hey, let me get your opinion on this fairly tokenistic role there.
Yeah, Nichole, please. No?
No, I didn't have anything. I think
Oh,
though,
sorry.
like Michael was saying, if I'm only coming out a couple of times a year and you're meeting more often than that, how valuable really is my opinion? Because I don't have the whole concept of everything. A lot of it just boils down to respect. I went to speak at a company once, and as soon as I finished speaking, they went on. They didn't ask if I wanted to stick around or anything, but they just sped me off and back to the airport, which was very upsetting and disappointing. And it was also hurtful because I felt like they were saying, come in, show everything, give your everything, and then we don't want you to hear anything else that we have to say. So just go ahead and go. So, I couldn't agree more with Michael with the no, don't use me as a token.
Which another pet peeve of mine, or rather gap, I should say, that could be addressed, is about the patient community's ability to learn not ability, opportunity to learn about compliance law and legal limitations and things like that. Because I have no doubt they would love you to have stayed, but they were just like, you got to go. That's what the law says. And I think that if we can, work with industry partners or anyone else about, you know, trying to interpret that a bit better, put it into practice in a way that doesn't feel like, yeah, you pour out your story, which was, I'm sure, awful to go through at the time, and it's so personal. And I think it leads on to about the wider point about how if you are participating in this, if we were working with on this call with PxP, and we didn't say anything about it, everybody's going to know this. I'm not sure what's going on here, but they've got some illness or something like that. So your heart is permanently on your sleeve all the time.
Right.
It's like
I just feel like they could have held another meeting another time or not included the patient. Maybe every other month include a patient and let them be involved in the whole meeting. And I mean, I probably would have turned it down, but it was the way in which it was conducted was really upsetting. Another patient and we went and spoke at one town hall that the company did. We did our story and they invited us to stay so we could hear about the research, hear about everything that's going on with them. That's real engagement in partnership with a patient, not this give story and then go out the side door and buy.
I personally, I'm a big fan of the email that says, sorry, I haven't been in touch, or rather, there's nothing to tell you. There's nothing to say. Things are happening. And I think that is just a really tiny thing which actually often helps. I think now, and someone as well says, the anonymous attendee, thank you, whoever you are. Do you get feedback on your contributions? And the answer might be yes, the answer might be no, but the other answer is it would definitely help. If you want to talk about, the gravitational pull towards research or any other patient engagement activity, just the feedback on it. If you perhaps review a trial protocol and the company wins the bid, or you name it, there's loads of things that you can do. And again, like I said to Sally almost an hour ago, none of what we do is rocket science. It's human values in patient engagement, human values in healthcare, human values in data. It's not rocket science. So I think now might be the time finally to go to Shamsunder's question about how do you develop a skill set for genuine patient engagement work so that the research community benefits from us. And I'm going to start with Michael, just because you are the academic here, as far as I'm aware, and then we'll go through everybody. So don't worry, everyone will get a chance to feedback.
Yeah, I think for myself, I think I would answer this from the academic, the clinical side of things, and it will go back to something I discussed earlier. The academic programs, we really need to do work in restructuring our programs to allow for the lived experience to be educated, to be thought about at the forefront in every course. There is not a single course in any academic healthcare program that should not have the lived experience at the forefront. There's just no excuse for it. If you can't do that, then you're probably not doing your healthcare program any justice. I think There were some comments in the chat earlier about, how can you teach empathy or can you teach compassion? I would argue you don't have to teach it. You have to pull it back out. I'm a pediatric therapist. You can go on a playground and see every child. They haven't been taught these things. These are inherent to who we are as humans. You see a child fall, you're going to see 20 kids gravitate to that person to see if they're okay, to do all these things that they've seen around them, that show empathy, that show compassion. Every human, with the exception of some rare diseases, has these things inherent to them. We need to pull them back out or ensure that they maintain throughout their education. For me, I think that would be a massive step in this direction.
Thank you, Michael. Sally?
I'm struggling with this question. My mind's gone a bit bananas, and I think I keep coming back to this feeling about being human. I've seen loads of books and guides and stuff that tells you what to do. I don't think it's the what, often it's the how. And I agree with Michael on this. I think we need to connect more as humans. I know that research, for example, my area of interest has to be transactional, it has to be functional. You have to get stuff done, but not at the expense of, like Nichole's experience of being trolleyed on and trolleyed off, and then no thought about what happens afterwards. That's just not very human. It's not very nice. So I'm almost questioning the question, which is very unusual for me, because it seems like a slam dunk question. There must be a way to do this, but I'm now backtracking, thinking, actually, are we just looking at this maybe the wrong way, and that we should be a bit more relaxed about how we interconnect? And I agree, Thomas, what you said earlier about there is a lot to be said for the casual encounter and question and curiosity about just how people are. What's happening for you before you get onto the business? I think it just breaks down so many barriers. So that's probably all I'll say.
And questioning the question is completely valid, and I think actually shows nicely actually a very, very complex issue. To put into practice would be very complicated. To think about it is complicated. To talk about it is complicated. So I completely understand.
Sorry, I just
Nichole,
want to add,
before we wrap up,
sorry, I just saw a comment about building a community of interest. Absolutely, sharing, finding out from other people where they've taken risks, what's happened, learning. Definitely a community practice is the way to go. And often they can be quite informal, and they can be very, very powerful and helpful. So sorry, just to build on that chat.
That's fine, Sally. Thank you for adding it. Thank you. Nichole, how can we build that skill set?
Yeah, so I'm, like Sally, the question is somewhat hard. But I think I'm going to go back to something that we learned in kindergarten. Treat others as you would want to be treated. So if you have a patient out here that you're trying to, reach out or do anything, the way that you treat them, how would you feel if your mother came and told you she was treated like that? And I just think, we can just go as simple as that.
It's not rocket science. It's not rocket science. And in the prep call for this, Michael was talking about sometimes if he feels, I think it was like disregarded or not taken seriously or not listened to properly, he sometimes has to. I'm Michael Falcon, PhD in blah blah blah, which should never happen. If anyone ever needs to say that, something has gone wrong. It's gone too far. I'm going to wrap this up now. I genuinely believe that this has been a special conversation. I really do. Clearly, I am biased, but just from what we're seeing in the chat, I would just like to thank you all for sharing your time, effort, and energy. This does take preparation to think about what you want to say, how you want to say it, what you're prepared to say, how do you respect your own boundaries and things like that. So thank you so much. And Rebecca, we'll hand back to you. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Really do appreciate everything our presenters gave to this session. It's very inspiring. I know that a lot of comments in the chat. I even saw something that said, this was my support group for today. They really felt like you were speaking to them. So thank you so much for everything. And thanks to the audience for your active participation. We saw so many comments. I know that there were so many questions that were, we just didn't have time to address every single question, but know that we saw them. And hopefully, as we were answering those questions, we were answering more other people's questions. So we're going to take a quick break for about 30 minutes and then come back at that point after 30 minutes for session number 3. So thank you so much for joining us. Quick 30-minute health break.